Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. Sly Fox is an ingenious comedy about sex and greed. It's written by one of our most prolific humorists, and I'm very pleased he's here with us tonight. To introduce him, Michael Riedel of the New York Post. Not unfamiliar with sex and greed.
Well, you don't want to miss this revival of Sly Fox, a really very, very wicked farce by a master of the Forum, Larry Gelbart, who of course has written Mastergate, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, City of Angels, and a play called Jump, which not many of us have seen, but apparently was a big hit in London, I'm told.
No.
It wasn't.
No, it was not. It was a play about suicide, and it proved to be well named. The show just died.
Larry Gelbart, welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you very much.
Now, I must ask you, you are traditionally credited with perhaps the funniest line ever said in about Broadway, which is that if Hitler's still alive, I hope he's out of town with a musical. Is that really yours?
That really is mine, except, you know, Mel Brooks came along and made Hitler a hit out of town, so the line doesn't really apply anymore.
Right. Where did you come up with that line, though?
It was a show called The Conquering Hero, also a misnomer. A musical that opened on Broadway, ran 4 nights. It was, I think, the only show I've ever heard of that opened without a director or choreographer credit. Bob Fosse was the original possessor of both those titles on the show. It just had enormous problems, terrible problems out of town. And I was in Philadelphia, and Arthur Penn and his wife Peggy came to visit my wife Pat and me, and it was in the middle of all this endless Sturm und Drang, you know, when a show is sick and it's out of town. And he said, how you doing? And I said what that line turned out to be.
And that line is still quoted today, and it went all over the place.
Well, either that says something about show business or Hitler. They're both very durable.
Right. Sly Fox was done originally in 76, was it, with George C. Scott?
Yes.
What was the reason for reviving it now? I mean, did you have to go back and look at it to see if it still held up well?
I looked at it in Boston once it was mounted, once it was trying out, and saw that parts of it did not, in fact, not so much hold up well, but were a little creaky and could be helped. So I made some changes, and I keep throwing. I once said to Arthur, I could write this pen. I once said to Arthur, yes, who was mightier than the sword. I said, you know, I could write that show forever, and it turns out I am. You know, because every time you see it, every time I see it, I want to do more with it.
And it's an adaptation of an adaptation, correct?
Yes, Ben Jonson, of course, wrote the original in 1606.
Right.
Yes. And by that time, Greed was already 1,606 years old, at least. And then Stefan Zweig, an Austrian playwright, wrote an adaptation in German. And it was translated into English and produced by the Theater Guild in 1928. And then I wrote an adaptation based on the English translation of the German adaptation of Ben Jonson's English version of Volpone.
Why did you write the play originally? Was it someone who came to you, or is it just something that you thought, you know, it's subject of greed and swindling was?
No, I wasn't. I always know a good idea when someone else has one.
Yeah.
Arthur Penn called me. Arthur and I had been friends for years and years, and never worked together. And he said he was in New York, I was in California, and said that he thought Volpone, you know, was certainly of the subject of it was fit for any time in any period. If that's not redundant, and if I'm not being redundant, I'm not being myself. And would I do an adaptation? Set it in San Francisco in the Gold Rush days, and it just seemed like a natural, and so I did.
The tricky business of constructing a farce. I mean, we had Michael Frayn on not too long ago, and he always said the hardest play the most difficult play for him to write was Noises Off, because he said,
Yes.
when you build these things and you want to change something down here, then the whole thing gives way over here, and you got to go back and structure it again.
Yeah, it's kind of if you remember pictures of logs floating down river, you know, to the paper mill, you know, you change one thing and everything starts piling up and bunching up. But I tell you, the best training for that was Forum, which was very intricately plotted, which I wrote with Bert Shevelov and Stephen Sondheim. You notice how people get rid of the collaborators real fast, which I wrote with, which I wrote with.
But now it's usually Stephen Sondheim's. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, I'm afraid, Larry.
Of course, it's become Stephen Sondheim's show, of course, and more power to somebody. Anyway, that was very, very, I mean, you talk about taking one thing out and having the whole house of cards collapse. We worked on that show for 5 years, and every time we made a minor change, it resulted in a major rewrite.
How much of that, in Forum, how much of that farcical running back and forth was constructed after you got into rehearsals?
It was all on paper.
All on paper first,
All on
and
paper.
then just done.
George Abbott, actually, who was the director of the original production, asked us to thin out the plot before we went to New Haven, which was our first tryout town. He said the audiences will never, never, never follow this. It's much too complicated. We said we would, but with the proviso that if we thought it was too thin, that we could put pieces back. And he said, you won't believe me. And we were right. And true to his word, he let us put in what we had and more.
So when you were working out the mechanics of Sly Fox, were you aware that there's always the danger of overloading the plot contortions in this kind of a play?
No, I wasn't worried so much, and I'm not worried so much as when I see the play now about the plot contortions, because I don't think it's very difficult to follow. What really bothers me is sometimes the multiplicity of words. You know, just too many words sometimes, too many ideas in one line that maybe by the time we get to the actor gets to the end of it, they forgot how it started.
And is that something you're realizing about the play as you watch it now that you did not know when you were writing it originally? Something new you've seen in the play?
Well, I didn't realize it originally. It's a form of showing off, really. You know, but now that I see it, I've simplified some stuff so that I hope I've eliminated that danger.
Now, when you sit down to write a play like Sly Fox, you're of course known for these these witty one-liners. Do they just kind of, as you're writing along, pop into your head and make you chuckle and you put them in, or do you labor over the joke just to make sure the rhythm is right and every word falls in the right place to get the laugh that you want?
It's a combination. Sometimes you write the idea of what you want someone to say, and then you take another look at it and make it that much funnier. Yes, it's stuff that pops into your head, obviously, with any luck at all. And then you hear the actor do it, and maybe you'll make a few adjustments based on his or her ability to do the line. But it's the currency for people who write comedy to think in a funny way.
There's a famous story about James Thurber, that he was at a dinner party and looking very peculiar, and somebody said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I'm writing." That it was always going on with him. Is that true of you, that you're...
Well, you're not talking to me now, I'm writing.
Yeah, that's right. But, I mean,
no, but whenever I run into you and we have a little exchange on an opening night or something, you always have a joke. I mean, you always leave a conversation with a snappy one-liner.
It's kind of a tick, you know. Sometimes I really... Someone just said recently, I forget where, but he said he gets angry at himself when he makes a joke because somehow it's sort of... He feels like he's trivialized himself or the situation or the conversation, and I feel at times much the same way.
But where did this gift develop? I mean, early in your life, when did you first discover you had this facility and this ability?
I can't give you the exact date.
Time, place, when you got your first laugh?
34 at 7 o'clock.
But didn't I read in the New York Times about you hanging out?
Hanging around my father's barbershop, and jokes are the thing there, you know, just kibitzing or, you know, guys trying to top one another. And my father, of course, not of course, but as it happens, knew every joke ever told. I mean, he just was miraculous in being able to tell a funny joke, not his own necessarily. And my mother was kind of a wicked wit, so I got the benefit of jokes as a form of communication and wit from her. I can't explain it. I really can't explain it.
You have written several movies, Tootsie, of course, Movie, a very good one that your friend Stanley Donen directed.
Thank you. That's kind of a secret hit.
It is, but it's a wonderful movie. I saw it not too long ago.
Yeah, I like it too.
And The Wrong Box, hilarious movie.
Right.
We were talking earlier about how writing for the movies has changed, and you were saying that it's now like like a football team. You know, they have this group that does the sentimentality and this that does the humor. How did that come about, do you think, in the history of movies? And does it mean that, is it one of the reasons why we get so many movies that just don't seem to be particularly well written anymore?
Well, they don't seem to have, what they don't have is an individual point of view. Woody Allen, of course, is lucky because there's no input from other people, though other people telling him what he really meant when he wrote it,
Right.
and fixing it so that it becomes something he didn't write or mean. It was always pretty much that way in movies in the early days because it was a little more glamorous, you know. Bud Schulberg was rewriting F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Right.
The names were a little better. And a lot of that, mainly because, I don't know, some actors, although that wasn't the case in the days of the studio system, they didn't really have much to say about the content of what they did. But directors and producers and heads of studios, you know, develop itches that the original writer just can't scratch anymore, and so they get someone else to do what it is that the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, there were 35 writers on the Flintstones. It didn't help, there could have been 70, of course.
Yeah.
But that's proliferated. You know, they really, out on the coast, get writers by the six-pack, you know? They have an enormous amount of money in the budget for rewriting so that they don't care if they send $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 million. And then there are production rewrites where people come in and make literally hundreds of thousands of dollars a day to fix scripts that they feel are in trouble in production. It all started with the blockbusters, I think. It all started with the need for, created by the studio's desire to roll craps with everyone. Like the whole studio will close down if this $200 million picture doesn't make it.
So we're certainly not going to trust one writer to do it.
Of course, of course.
But is there any way a team of writers could have written Tootsie?
Is there any way?
Yeah.
Well, there was a way.
Oh, there were?
I mean, there were several people. It got to be ridiculous. You
On
know?
Tootsie, huh?
On Tootsie. I remember calling Sidney Pollack, who was directing it back here, and I said, you know, what is this new name I read now, Jim somebody? And he said, well, he's just stitching scenes together. I said, well, can he get a seamstress credit instead of a writing credit? Because credits do get debased, you know.
Of course, yeah.
Well, when that happens, are you?
Do you like to work that way at all?
Yeah,
or do you,
I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it. Who
then
likes it?
How do you handle it? I mean, you just have to swallow it and be philosophical.
That's
or,
why there's so many Porsche dealers in California and BMWs on the street. Really, because people buy some pride in what they did, even though what they did is no longer on the screen. The writing credits rarely reflect the true story.
Yeah. Now, you wrote two of the great musical comedies, City of Angels and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And I always have been hearing for, 15 years I've been writing about
Comedy
this.
Tonight.
Yeah, a comedy, right. We should get Larry Gelbart to do the book to this musical. How come you haven't written more musicals?
Because I moved to the coast. I think if I lived here all through the years, I would have, and been on a more almost neighborhood basis, with the theater, and people in it, I would have done more. But I got
hooked up in MASH.
I did do MASH. Well,
Yeah.
what happened was I left New York in 62, 63, went to England for a few weeks and stayed 9 years. And so when I made my re-entry back into the States, I had to go to California really and work. We had 5 kids.
You hadn't made enough at that point in your life to do what you wanted to do? Or?
No.
Well, in England in the 9 years, were you having the 5 kids, or were you working on?
That's a lot of work.
No, we took 5 kids to England.
Oh, but what did you do in England? Did you write there?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Not very much. I
Yeah.
wrote Jump, and you can see how well that did.
Yeah, I think so. They came back.
So I came back. I'd written the MASH pilot, and so I came back to California, and just try to do the best work I could in television or wherever. I mean, you don't think, well, I can write less now. I'm in a different medium. You write as, the best you can wherever you are.
So did you? And those 9 years in London, were you taking a break from writing? I mean, you had spent your whole young adulthood writing the Caesar Hour and television and Broadway musicals, and then
Well, it turned out to be an enormous breather. I just didn't do much at all, and I didn't do much.
Why did you just?
I don't know. Well, by the time I moved to England, I'd been writing maybe 20 years, in radio, in television, and as it turned out, the theater. So I didn't mind sort of being a bum, kind
You
of.
didn't do anything?
A little bit. It was less expensive to live there. To live there at that time, but there were 7 of us, and inexpensive times 7 is already expensive.
Right.
So I did very little. I would sneak back to this country, and write a pilot or 2 and go back there. But I didn't do much.
How interesting. So are you a writer who has to write every day?
Yes,
Now you do.
the doctor says I must.
For your health.
Doctor, yes.
Will you write
For my
today?
wife's health. What?
Will you write today?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
You will.
Yeah.
Now, we're taping this in the morning. What are you going to do? Go back home and sit down this afternoon, or?
I'll go to the hotel. I have my laptop, and I'll work on a screenplay I'm working on.
Interesting. Sly Fox, this revival stars Richard Dreyfus, giving a very fine performance as Foxwell J. Sly, who bilks everybody. But the original starred George C. Scott, whose performance, not to overshadow Richard's performance, but his performance is still much talked about. And in fact, at the opening night, people were, the theater world, everyone in it has been in it a long time. There hasn't been a churning. So everyone who was there at this opening was there at the opening originally.
Exactly.
And they were talking about George. The difference between George C. Scott's approach to this role and Richard Dreyfuss's approach is?
I think, in a word, danger.
Yeah.
There was always a dangerous element about George. One of the first, I guess, the first word is surprise, that George C. Scott, General Patton, the hustler, this dark, evil guy, could be funny, and indeed he was. That's the main. Richard is more devilish.
Right.
George was dark yet funny, which is a neat trick to pull off.
Yeah.
George's glare at the audience almost defied them, not to laugh. And then at the end, his curtain calls, I used to live for his curtain calls. He stared at them like, how dare you watch me when I'm acting?
An easy man to get along with, George?
A pussycat.
Really?
Just an absolute dream. And he did something I've never, ever had experience with in my life. I made really major rewrites all through our tryout period in Baltimore and in Boston, and then in previews in New York. I mean, whole pages. And I would hand out, those are the days when I still wrote just in a very soft pencil and legal tablets, me and Nixon. And I would hand out these handwritten sides to the players, and George would say, whether it was a line or a speech or really a whole page, he'd say, just read it to me, don't show it to me. And I would read it to him, and it stuck. It was phenomenal. I think the wonderful thing about George as an actor was he never distanced himself from anything. That's why when he worked in a terrible picture, it was all the more embarrassing in a way, because he really believed in what he was doing.
Yeah.
Richard is a lighter. I don't mean he's George C. Scott light.
Yeah.
I mean his approach is lighter.
Is Richard Dreyfus a pussycat?
Yes, he's a marvelously decent guy, and has a life outside the theater.
Yeah.
Great interest in a lot of.
It's interesting. I was thinking of your cast. You have Renee Auberjonois, Bob Dishy, Richard Dreyfus, and I was thinking about some of the trouble that they've had replacing Matthew Broderick and Nathan Lane and the producers. There seemed to be a group of actors getting smaller and smaller that can do the kind of comedy that you and Mel Brooks and comes from the Sid Caesar hour. Do you have any fear that that sort of style of comedy will not be able to be done by actors in the not too distant future? Is it a hard world?
I hope to be dead by then.
By then,
so
yeah.
I won't be worrying. No, it's true. You have to know the Broadway. When I say Broadway, even nightclub. I mean, you have to know the kind of Milton Berle comedy. You have to know the kind of Caesar stuff. You have to know how to do that. So a lot that I've done, won't be, I don't think, repeatable or in the same spirit.
Why is that spirit sort of going?
Well, the people who did that kind of comedy had experience in nightclubs.
You all came out of the same world in some ways, maybe.
But yeah, I didn't, because I'm not from New York, but the New York people, all the Sid Caesar crowd was Tamiment inspired. They'd all worked in the mountains. They'd all done entirely original reviews once a week.
Right.
And carry that experience over with them. The younger comedians are either doing stand-up or working in a contemporary way
They're in
doesn't.
improv groups.
And improv,
Yeah.
you're better off actually in improv because
Yeah.
if you can improvise, you can improvise that kind of style.
Yeah.
But purely verbal comedians have trouble being kind of shticky, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, with the replacing Nathan Lane, I mean, he is kind of a throwback to that world, and there's so few like that.
I know. It's remarkable.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think they're coming from anywhere, the next crop. I mean.
No, I mean, I agree with you. It'd be hard to imagine a Sly Fox being revived 20 years from now, and the kind of actors of like Renee and Bob Dishy, if they could really tap into that sensibility.
I'm not sure. And of course, Forum too. Forum is in danger of extinction in a way.
Yeah, and the sense you get from Dishy and Renee is that they've done so much theater over so many years. Aside, you know, I know Dishy's improv and Renee did repertory forever, and those are really stage actors with such craft, and that's what we're not.
Yes, but what you have to have is the craft
and the timing.
And the timing, and you have to know how to do a take. You know, you have to know.
Wit, yeah.
You know, you have to rely on what they probably think are very primitive methods of getting a laugh. You know,
really.
And there's a rhythm. And it's kind of a street smart rhythm. I think older comedians were less educated. They learned their smarts on the stage. I think younger comedians are smarter, book smarter, maybe world smarter, but not street smarter.
And do you think perhaps that when you say these comedians that weren't so well educated, that the humor that they found is sort of what they were able to use to get them out of perhaps the poverty that they lived in, and that's what
it was either that or
their
become
currency.
or become a prize fighter. You know, I mean, there were just so many things you could do to lift yourself above that level.
So is this why Forum's almost obsolete also, because even though it's scripted, that they just don't have the timing?
Because the laughs are still in Forum. I mean, it's laid out very clearly for you in your book.
It is, but in the wrong hands, and very often it's in the wrong hands, it looks like a high school play. They're doing it in London actually this summer at the National Theatre. We'll see who's left over there. Who knows
who can do it? Yeah. Any plans to do another Broadway musical?
Yes.
What?
Exactly what? I did a musical review. It's too hard to describe what it is actually, but Cy Coleman did the music and Alan and Marilyn Bergman did the lyrics.
Out in L.A.
Out in L.A. We
yeah.
called it Like Jazz. It won't be called that when it gets here. We need another title, clearly, we feel. And we hope to be back here within a year. I've done the sort of connective tissue.
So you're the seamstress, sort of.
Exactly. That's how my mother started in this country, as an immigrant girl, and I guess we revert to our roots, right? I'm sewing together this little show.
for Cy and Marilyn and Ellen.
Yes.
All right. Well, Larry Gelbart, it's always a pleasure. I should always.
Always. It's always going to be a pleasure.
It's always going to be a pleasure to have you coming back.
Thanks.
Sly Fox, a very funny play, given a fine revival at the Ethel Barrymore Theater with Richard Dreyfus.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being our guest on Theater Talk.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Could you have played French?
With difficulty.
But the British.
No, I don't.
Could you have done French?
I know disaster.
We didn't want anyone to say, oh, this is how the Parisians behave, this is how they are in Europe, this is the way they talk in high society in London. That it seemed very important for the audience, which is, you know, we have a New York audience was our target, that it be set here so people could relate to it.
And you know, we have a French program at the station, and I was discussing this with the French producers, and they were saying, well, you know, this is really a very American play. The way these people behave are
well, that's what, yeah.
not French at all.
It's more the Brits would accept you speaking in your own, you know, in British and English, British English, and they would accept that was French because the play said it was. Those Americans would never accept that unless we were talking like this. Why would we be doing that?
Matthew
wouldn't
said
be.
it's not out of the norm for British people to be living in Paris. That it's you know that people it's not
They
very
shun
far
off the
away.
guys,
Yeah, exactly. And it was inconceivable that these 4 Americans would be living in Paris. I think Yasmina originally didn't want to change the locales. The first day we all met, we were sitting around the table and we changed a couple of locations. She said, I feel I'm losing my play, you know. And we could understand why, that it suddenly, those weren't her words and those weren't her choices.
How did you solve that issue? How did you bring her along and say, okay, we're going to...
She loves Matthew,
She trusts Matthew.
She only had 3 days here, and then she left.
She went to direct a movie.
The accusation against Foxwell J. Sly, playing over here as Exhibit A, was based on the statement of one single witness only, and that testimony has been contradicted by more than several other witnesses, up to and including no less than the put upon woman who accuses the accused of no unseemly conduct, even though in connection with him she was to find herself thereunder. Moreover, the husband of the aforesaid harbors no suspicion and makes no charge that any crime was committed upon her corpus that was in any way delicti. And finally, the court feels that the miserable condition of the accused makes the possibility of an act of sex dependent only upon an act of God.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
Playbill Online is the official website of Theater Talk and the home of the Playbill Club, providing information and opportunities for theater lovers. We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.